He was a spark before he was a star. A boy in a narrow room, learning how to keep the dark at arm's length, with a grin and a sound that made strangers lean closer. The world would one day know him as Eddie Murphy, a legend whose laugh could lift a city. But first, he was simply a kid walking cracked sidewalks in Bushwick, repeating lines under his breath, turning the cold into rhythm and the fear into timing. From the outside, it was just another Brooklyn day. Sirens far away, neighbors talking through thin walls, the television humming like a small sun. Inside, a child studied how faces change when joy hits them, how sorrow blinks and backs away when a joke lands just right. That study became a ritual, and the ritual became a craft, not as escape, but as endurance. He learned early that humor can be armor, a lantern, and a bridge all at once, and he built all three with his bare hands. The crowd in his head became a promise to himself. One day they won't just hear me, they'll feel the echo long after the lights cut to black. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There was a man who carried a badge and a punchline in the same pocket. A father whose job kept the city steady, while his side stage wit kept a family breathing. Charles Edward Murphy had that rare mix of duty and spark, the kind that turns an ordinary evening into a living room set. In those early hours, before life split into before and after, he would play with voices and shapes of stories, and a small boy would watch a world unfold across the space between two chairs. The lessons were not in lectures. They were in cadence, in the curve of a setup, in the beat you hold right before release. A father can teach by speaking, but more by being. And through him, a door opened. The stage wasn't a mystery. It was a room you could reach by walking toward the sound of your own nerve. The boy learned. The future listened. Comment or write Rip Charles Edward Murphy to honor them. And there was a mother whose voice could carry weight like silk carries light. The steady thread that kept the fabric from tearing when the seams pulled tight. Lillian working, phoning, finding enough for the next day did not promise a life without hardship. She gave something greater, a calm, a tone that said the storm will not name us. When illness came and rearranged the furniture of their lives, the boy felt the floor tilt under his feet. But even in that tilt, even in the long pause that sends children to new rooms and temporary names on new doors, her grace remained like a soft hand at his back. When she returned, when health gave her voice back its warmth, a home remade itself from the inside out. In that quiet remaking, the boy learned a different rhythm. Resilience does not roar, it hums. Comment or write Rip Lillian to honor them. In a new chapter, there is always a new peeper of the light. Vernon Lynch didn't arrive with the noise of rescue. He arrived with the patience of routine, the sound of work boots, the scent of something sweet from a plant, where the days were counted in shifts, not in spotlights. He offered the simplest gift a boy can receive: stability. A different street, a small house that held more hope than square footage, and rules that were not a cage but a scaffold. The young comedian in the making found room to test laughter against quieter walls, to measure how it travels across a kitchen table and down a hallway, to find out what remains when the applause is just the rustle of a newspaper. With that steadiness, the jokes sharpened, the timing tightened, and the dream stopped being a fantasy and became a schedule. Comment or write Rip Vernon Lynch to honor them. He stepped into a circle of light for the first time in a room that smelled of youth and dust and possibility. And he didn't bring 1,000 voices, only one, shaped into a song borrowed for an instant. Al Green was not in the building. Still, the echo of that soul lived in the teenager's mouth as he tried on someone else's music to discover his own. Nerves shook, feet found a rhythm late, and then laughter rose clean, surprised, forgiving. It was not about the perfect note. It was about the courage to try one. That night did not crown him. It awakened him. It told him the stage would meet him halfway if if he showed up with honesty in his hands. Comment or write Rip Al Green to honor them. The city beyond the window demanded sweat and late trains, and he paid both. He counted coins at turnstiles, memorized jokes between station stops, and learned to trust the brutal kindness of 2 rooms where an audience gives you nothing you didn't earn. He stitched a language from glimpses in giants, from fragments of brilliance caught in the glow of other men's magic. There was a flint-spark rawness he studied like scripture, the way a master can pull truth up from the floorboards and make it dance under a hot mic. He didn't imitate to hide. He tried on cadences the way an apprentice tries on tools, just long enough to learn what cuts and what carves. In that grind, nights became anvil and hammer, and the boy's sound, once thin and desperate, thickened into something unmistakable. Comment or write Rip Richard Pryor to honor them. Smoothness is its own school, a glide that moves through a room without breaking a glass. From that school, he took the lesson of polish, how to hold a story so steady you can pour it without spilling a drop, how to let decency itself be a punchline spine. In Smoke and Neon, he experimented with quiet power, with the careful tempo that turns a smile into a confession, and a confession into a shared relief. What he borrowed, he refined. What he respected, he transformed. And every time a crowd exhaled in relief at the end of a bit that felt like a gentle landing, he knew he had added one more brushstroke to the portrait he was painting of a voice only he could own. Comment or write Rip Bill Cosby to honor them. Grit has its prophets, and he studied one who could turn the roughness of life into laughter that tasted like a shot-hot, unfiltered necessary. In those late rooms, he heard how a joke can walk with a swagger and still hug you from the inside, how a performer can be both tender and sharp in a single breath. That taught him the balance. Not all light is soft. Sometimes the brighter flame comes with a burn, and sometimes the burn is what makes the audience remember. He was still young, but his ears were old in the best way. He let the sawdust and the sparkle coexist, and slowly the blend became his signature silk with steel under it. Comment or write Rip Red Fox to honor them. Phones rang, doors opened a sliver at a time, and then a broadcast stage called that was drowning in its own quiet. He walked into a machine built for laughter and found it coughing. Weeks passed in margins, his name tucked under the day's pages, his presence a shadow kept in reserve. Then a night came when the show fell short and the red light demanded a miracle on command. He stepped forward, not as a plea, but as an answer. Faces, voices, the electric snap of timing forged on trains and in basements. He poured it all into those minutes. The silence broke like glass. The studio didn't just cheer. It remembered how to breathe. He left that night with his reflection in a dark window. A tired kid with nothing in his pocket, but a future that had finally found his address. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There are seasons when the camera finds you before you have learned to find yourself on camera, but momentum does not ask permission. He leapt from live television into film, with an entrance that felt less like a debut and more like a declaration. A screen can be cold, but his presence warmed it until it moved, until it ran. The city that had been skeptical handed him the keys, and he drove with equal parts dare and grace. He made a partnership on one film feel like a cultural handshake, two energies colliding and clicking, a satire that felt like a mirror tilted toward power and habit. Audiences showed up not just to laugh, but to feel seen in the laughter, to watch a young man test the limits of charisma and discover he could push farther still. Comment or write Rip Dan Aykroyd to honor them. And then he sprinted past numbers that studios put in frames, past all the ways industry keeps score to protect itself. A cop with a grin and a soundtrack became a phenomenon, and the boy they once asked to wait in the hall became the person whose name turned doors into runways. He did not fit the old formulas. He rewrote them with his own ink. There's a difference between being welcomed and being undeniable, and he crossed that line with a smile that never asked for approval, only room. But the faster the ascent, the thinner the oxygen. He rose, and behind the roar, he heard the familiar hush that returns when the stage goes dark and the hotel room is large enough to echo. What he gave to the world grew, and what he kept for himself had to learn new ways to stay alive. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. A crown invites a heavier responsibility than metal can hold. He wore it through a stretch of filmmaking where everything was expected and almost nothing forgiven. He reached backward with honor, inviting the very elders whose shadows once sheltered him to stand beside him under one title. It was an offering at a risk, an attempt to build a long table where there had only been separate rooms. The responses were mixed, the applause uneven, and he learned a harsh lesson about trying to compose grace in an industry that measures it by numbers and nerve. Yet even in that moment, where the lights felt colder and the seats emptier, he was still carving a route no one had left for him. He would walk home through a city that suddenly seemed indifferent, carrying not defeat, but the blueprint for reinvention. Comment or write Rip Richard Pryor to honor them. Legends are not made by a straight line. They are formed in the bends where a person decides who they are without a spotlight. He chose the long road of craft, of building again from the inside out, and when he returned with the professor made of many faces inside one frame, the laughter rang out with relief and awe. It was more than a hit. It was a reminder that transformation is the truest magic. From there, new worlds opened where his voice could fly without a face, where animated realms needed a heartbeat only he could provide. Children laughed without knowing they were hearing a master at ease, and their parents recognized an old friend in a new shape. He had moved from phenomenon to foundation, less a moment, more a current. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. But the story of ascent and artistry is also the story of a man who never outran that quiet that followed him from childhood. He could fill arenas with joy and still end the night with a room that insisted on truth. And so he carried that truth carefully, letting the hurt breathe without feeding it, letting time teach him that the point was never to conquer the silence, but to befriend it. In befriending it, he found the courage to surprise the world with sorrow shaped into song. A performance that made audiences ache in a new way. Awards circled, some landed, some didn't, and he learned the discipline of leaving the room with dignity when applause and judgment twisted into one sound. The lesson stuck, the art deepened, the man grew stiller at the center. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Return is a holy word when it's earned. Decades after that first rescue on live television, he stepped back onto the same stage to a welcome that felt less like nostalgia and more like gratitude. Comedians who had built their houses with bricks he helped fire stood beside him, not as rivals, but as sons of the same craft. He didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to smile, and the room understood. Honors followed that felt like acknowledgments from history itself, not for the loudness of his career, but for its endurance. He accepted, not as a man chasing crowns, but as a survivor of storms who had learned to walk in the sunshine without forgetting the weather that made him. Comment or write Rip Chris Rock to honor them. Some names exist like parallel rivers, running alongside his voices of eras that overlapped, that traded oxygen in the same rooms, that argued and agreed in the way only artists can. Their admiration said as much about him as any headline. To be called a blueprint by those who build is a rarer accolade than any statue. To be cited in the rhythm of others is proof that you didn't just entertain, you altered the tempo of a generation's breath. Those echoes gathered around him, not as noise, but as a choir. He listened. He bowed his head. He kept working. Comment or write Rip Dave Chappelle to honor them. The path from a Brooklyn window to the center of a culture can break a person or bend them toward compassion. He bent toward compassion. He chose family hours over flashbulbs, chose roles for what they said rather than what they paid, chose the long burn of relevance over the flair of the moment. In that choice lay a peace he had once believed unreachable. When the day ends, there is a sound in a quiet house that money cannot buy. Footsteps you love, pages turning, someone laughing in another room. He learned to measure success in that music. He learned to keep the old armor near, but to wear it only when necessary. The rest of the time, he walked unguarded through the rooms he built, remembering the kid who whispered lines to the night, so the night would whisper back that he mattered. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He stood amid a semicircle of peers who understood the language of timing at the cellular level, the ones who know the difference between a laugh that's loud and a laugh that lands. One of them was a hurricane with a smile, a man who discovered how to turn relentless work into an instrument that could fill stadiums. He had come up on the shoulders of those who cracked the walls before him. And when he looked over at the pioneer from Bushwick, he didn't see only a childhood idol, he saw a map. If you listened closely, you could hear pieces of cadence, the quick darting pivots, the sprint to a punchline, and the clean follow-through that leave a crowd breathless. Admiration isn't imitation. It's gratitude with craft in it, and he carried that gratitude openly. In conversations and specials and moments off stage, when no camera was rolling, he'd underline a simple truth. Doors don't open themselves. Somebody pushed first. Comment or write Rip Kevin Hart to honor them. Across the ocean and across years, another voice rose with a gentle curiosity sharpened into wit. A storyteller who braided history and now into jokes that sneak up on you and then refuse to leave. He learned the same lessons in different rooms. That comedy can be a compass, a balm, and a lever that lifts what is too heavy to move alone. When he spoke of lineage, he didn't reach for vague flattery. He traced trajectories, pointed to the moment a young prodigy on a live show made possibility feel less abstract. In that thread lay a respect that crossed borders and accents, a recognition that a singular path in one city can redraw the map for thousands in others. The result was a conversation between eras, carried through microphones and shared silences. Proof that laughter is a language with many dialects, but one origin, the courage to try. Comment or write Rip Trevor Noah to honor them. Before the arenas and the accolades, before the marble foyers and framed posters, there was a woman who understood how to sit quietly with the version of him that didn't belong to the public. She wasn't a headline or a performance. She was a private promise kept in the spaces between call sheets. He found in her something the road kept stealing, a pause. They made small rituals from ordinary things takeout on a kitchen floor, a shared glance over some late-night show, unguarded laughter that wasn't meant to be captured. The world around them was too loud to sustain that stillness forever, but the stillness held long enough to leave warmth that didn't fade. The boy who grew up learning to be funny, so he wouldn't break, discovered around her that softness is not weakness, it is shelter. Comment or write Rip Plett McNeely to honor them. When work turns into weather, and the forecast is constant motion, a life can fracture into fragments that don't speak to each other. He met another soul who kept the volume low and the heart clear. Someone who didn't demand the legend, but accepted the ordinary man with his suitcase of unfinished sentences. Together they built a simple circle walks without cameras, dinners without applause, the merciful quiet of two people who didn't need performance to validate presence. Seasons shifted as they do, and the circle opened again, not with alarms, but with the hush that comes from trying to carry a heavy thing too far without rest. What remained was respect, a soft-edged memory that never asked to be more than it was. Two lives intersecting in a hard year and giving each other ease. Comment or write Rip Tamara Hood to honor them. There are chapters that feel like sunlight seen through a high window, and one began beneath a chandelier where vows are louder than music. She had the grace of someone who refuses to be impressed by what cannot love you back. And with her, he tried what every restless heart eventually wants. A home that doesn't vanish when the applause does. Together, they curated morning cereal bowls, cartoon soundtracks, a door opening and small feet sprinting, the kind of soundtrack that renders box office numbers irrelevant. There were birthdays with more frosting than formality, travel with more inside jokes than itineraries, and the slow dawn of understanding that family is not a pose. It's a practice. When distance arrived, it did not arrive as a villain, but as the sum of 1,000 tiny unshared hours. Their parting was not a battle, it was a bow, but gratitude lingered, an enduring acknowledgement that they had built something beautiful that time simply could not hold. Comment or write Rip Nicole Mitchell to honor them. A firstborn daughter can turn a hallway into a gallery where the future hangs, and her drawings made the walls speak faces, hands, a house with too many windows, because that's how love looks from the vantage point of youth. She carried the radiance of a beginning, that confident tilt of the chin that says a legacy isn't a weight, it's a wind at your back. To watch her was to realize how the craft that once served as armor could soften into a shelter as well. She did not need the world to know her, to be luminous inside the rooms that mattered. She was proof that the most important stage lights are often just the sun falling through a window at the right time. Comment or write Rip Bria to honor them. A son who inherits silence differently sometimes learns how to hear the house breathe, the hum of a refrigerator, the thud of a basketball against the driveway at dusk, the quiet of a father thinking with his hands. His presence filled spaces without insisting on them, and in those spaces, he stitched his own patterns of purpose. There's a way some children carry legacy without wearing it like armor shoulders unbowed, step steady. He took after both laughter and resolve, understanding that the most durable joy is built, not bought. And when he looked toward the man whose name filled marquees, he saw not a legend at a distance, but a parent reaching across years to offer stability he once had to want more than he had. Comment or write Rip Miles to honor them. Another daughter, with grace like a sentence that lands softly, brought her own tempo to the family music. She understood the camera as a thing you can choose, not a thing that chooses you. To carry your father's name and yet sound like yourself is an art, and she practiced it in quiet decisions. What to share, what to hold, when to speak, when to keep a memory as a private room you don't tour. In her smiles lived chapters the world would never read and didn't need to. Not every legacy is loud. Some legacies move through a house like a warm draft, unseen, absolutely felt. Comment or write Rip Shane to honor them. There was an artist's eye in another child. The second you notice how light falls on a cheek, you become a curator of joys. She saw the world in frames without ever treating life like a performance. If a family is an orchestra, she had the ear for harmony. Her laughter didn't try to outshine others. It tried to blend. In that blend lived her strength, the generosity to hear other notes and make room for them. A different kind of stage opened wherever she went. Kitchens, patios, back seats of cars where road trip playlists teach patience and taste. Her presence argued persuasively that the everyday, faithfully loved becomes its own masterpiece. Comment or write Rip Zala to honor them. The youngest of that chapter arrived like a closing cadence that somehow opens a brand new song, Small Hands. Quick feet, that shy bravery of children who run first and consider later. She taught him that bedtime stories can be better than any red carpet, that a single again, shouted from a pillow fort, is a box office smash that doesn't require a ledger. In her voice, he heard the melody of a second chance, not to redo the past, but to savor the present. The man who once outran sleep to chase sets learned to measure nights by the softness of breathing beside him. And in that gentleness, the world outside the gates briefly ceased to exist. Comment or write Rip Bella to honor them. Then the storm everyone could see from the sidewalk arrived in a flashbulb chorus, and the headlines assembled their blunt instruments. She was fire where he was calm, a force in her own right who knew the contours of the stage's hunger. Two bold lives collided, beautiful when aligned, volatile when the old damages rose to speak without invitation. They moved from spark to blaze too quickly for the wind to obey, and private disagreements turned into public fodder. Somewhere inside the spectacle was a real story of two human beings, trying, failing, trying again. When the narrative emptied itself of nuance, they stepped away and did the hardest thing. They let time replace noise. Comment or write Rip Mel B to honor them. A child born in the aftermath can carry the truest arithmetic of love. Her name held both parents in it like a bridge, and the first time he held her, he didn't hear opinion. He heard breath. The world had talked too loudly for too long, but an infant has a way of quieting rooms without asking. In her gaze, he recognized the clean honesty that pulled him toward comedy in the first place. The desire to turn hurt into something that makes people stay. As birthdays gathered and the story softened, he chose consistency over commentary, presence over performance. The lesson she offered without words was simple. You can't rewrite yesterday, but you can write down today carefully enough that tomorrow has a chance. Comment or write Rip Angel Iris Murphy Brown to honor them. Peace sometimes arrives wearing white on a shoreline far from the city's home. She met him at the intersection of caution and hope, a producer who knew both the backstage mechanics and the front-of-house pressure of entertainment. They'd both loved before and learned hard truths. Perhaps that's why their steps were measured. On sand that squeaked under bare feet, they spoke vows shaped more by intention than by spectacle, each syllable a prayer that the calm could hold. What followed wasn't scandal. It was reality asserting itself with kind hands. They chose to honor what was beautiful by refusing to drag it where it would break. Parting with grace is a high form of love. They did it quietly, with respect that did not need witnesses. Comment or write Rip Tracy Edmonds to honor them. The music producer whose name braided into her history stood off to one side of the wider story, a man who understood melodies that live behind the words. In the lexicon of fame, he had his own dictionary, his own verbs. When paths diverge, dignity is the measure, and he kept his. Not every figure in a narrative must be amplified to be essential. Sometimes a name appears like a rest in a bar of music, a necessary silence that shapes the phrase. By acknowledging the presence without dramatizing it, the larger portrait respects the living truth. Lives overlap, histories touch, and the resulting chord is real, even when it's no longer ringing. Comment or write Rip Babyface to honor them. Years later, Serenity knocked softly and waited. She opened the door without flourish, a person who preferred the clean lines of privacy to the messy patterns of constant performance. With her, he rediscovered the holiness of routine coffee that tastes like morning, walks that feel like therapy, laughter that doesn't need to be remembered to matter. They built their days like craftspeople, choosing materials that last, patience, kindness, and the humility to learn each other anew. To the outside world, their life looked quiet. To them, it sounded like abundance. In her stillness, he found motion of the right kind and inward settling. Comment or write Rip Page Butcher to honor them. A daughter's first giggle can erase a decade of noise. When she arrived, the house shifted its gravity. The legend became a father on the floor again, stacking blocks with exaggerated voices that belonged to no character, but to the family's private cast. Her name carried music. Her eyes carried mirrors. Through them, he watched time double back and offer him another chance to be fully present for the moments that don't make headlines, but make a life. Every bedtime settled a little dust from all the roads he'd run. Every morning reset the day with a sunrise inside the kitchen. Comment or write Rip Izzy Una Murphy to honor them. Then came a son whose middle name was Aval. He was cradled not only by arms, but by memory, wrapped in a lineage of laughter that had once kept two young brothers warm, in rooms where hope felt like a rumor. The name on his birth certificate spoke to a bond that distance and years had only burnished. When he gripped a parent's finger for the first time, it felt like a relay sorrow passing the baton to joy without pretending they weren't on the same team. In his presence, grief learned better manners. It sat down, made room at the table, and watched as life continued. Comment or write Rip Max Charles Murphy to honor them. Brotherhood is a country with its own laws, and theirs was sovereign. He was the first witness to the early experiments. A kid laughing on a couch in foster care when the television taught endurance. A companion who knew the difference between the public face and the private ache. When illness took him, it was as if a foundation stone slipped quietly out of the wall. The building still stood, but every room knew what had changed. The older siblings' mischief, a side eye across a crowded set, the call that always found the needed word. These became relics and then became blessings. In the silence that followed, the surviving brother didn't shout. He honored by carrying forward what they forged together. Humor that respects the weight of what it lifts. Comment or write Rip Charlie Murphy to honor them. In the wider circle of craft, the roll call continued friends and fellow travelers whose generosity of spirit marked an era. One of them, resilient as iron and playful as a horn line, had stood with him on a night when a return felt like a homecoming inside a cathedral of laughter. Their embrace looked like a victory lap shared across generations. In that moment, the room confirmed what the years had been implying. The house that comedy built has many rooms, and this man helped design the blueprint. As he looked over the audience and back to the stage, there was only gratitude for the building, for the bricks, for the company. Comment or write Rip Tracy Morgan to honor them. The honors came not as fireworks, but as constellations. Some arrived stamped with the authority of institutions, bearing names that echo through the halls of literature and wit. He accepted with a posture that said the point was never the trophy. The point was the journey that made it make sense. A stage that once felt like survival now felt like stewardship. And when the speeches ended and the cameras retreated, he returned to the life he had chosen on purpose. Fewer flights, more dinners. He would still step onto sets when the story sang to him, but he no longer let the world dictate the tempo. The loudest applause became the hush at the end of a day well lived. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There's a rhythm to survival that only age can teach. For Eddie Murphy, the rhythm had slowed, not from fatigue, but from understanding. The years that once sprinted past him had begun to walk beside him, calm, deliberate, steady. The mansions, the cars, the trophies, symbols of a life earned through laughter, now stood simply as quiet reflections of persistence. He was no longer chasing anything. The world, in turn, had learned to come to him. When he walked through the garden of his Beverly Hills home, the same streets that once echoed with a rush of ambition now listened instead to the sound of a man who had learned the secret of joy. That it doesn't shout. It hums low and constant, like music heard through a door half closed. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Every empire tells two stories, the one the world sees and the one the walls keep. His kingdom wasn't built from marble, but from moments. Behind the towering gates of his estate lay a theater that knew both the thrill of laughter and the hush of thought. There was a pool fed by a waterfall that shimmered like liquid applause, a pizza oven tucked under ivy that smelled like Sunday afternoons instead of success, and a court where a father could still feel the rhythm of movement in his legs as his children called his name. Wealth, for him, had become less about ownership and more about memory. He walked those halls not as a conqueror, but as a witness to his own endurance. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Beyond the hills, another chapter glowed in memory. A sun-washed estate where earlier dreams had unfolded. Granite Bay. Even the name sounded solid, grounded, resilient. There years ago, he had written, rested, and watched the world from a distance safe enough to breathe. The laughter that drifted through that home was of children learning what joy sounds like when it isn't being performed. Every corner whispered of family dinners, late-night melodies, the muffled echo of movies watched together. It was a home that taught him that legacy isn't architecture. It's the air that lingers after the laughter stops. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. His journey through space mirrored his journey through time. Each home, each car, each possession was a bookmark, not a boast. In the gleam of polished metal, a Rolls-Royce, a Ferrari, an Aston Martin, there wasn't vanity but testimony. A kid who once rode the train to open mics now had keys that opened dreams he hadn't dared to picture. The roar of engines wasn't arrogance. It was gratitude turned mechanical. Even the private jet and the quiet yacht were extensions of the same truth. Freedom was never about escaping people. It was about finally being able to arrive somewhere as yourself. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. The truest luxury he ever owned was silence. After years of performing for the world, he began performing for peace. He woke with the sunrise instead of alarms. He ate simply, laughed genuinely, breathed deeply. Gone were the endless scripts and meetings that measured life in scenes. What replaced them were mornings in the garden, conversations without cameras, and a renewed devotion to the body that had carried him through so much chaos. Yoga, walks, the stillness of reflection, all small rituals that whispered the same thing. Survival is an art too. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He had mastered what the industry often forgets, that control is the rarest currency. When studios chased him for roles, he chose stories that spoke to his spirit, not his bank account. He wasn't rejecting success. He was redefining it. The long-awaited fourth return of his iconic detective wasn't a comeback. It was a choice, done entirely on his own terms. He didn't need a script to remind him who he was. He wrote his own, line by line, built from patience, wisdom, and the kind of confidence that doesn't require noise. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He had learned the difference between making a fortune and making meaning. When the world chased excess, he built excellence. He understood that laughter can be an economy of healing, and he invested accordingly. Behind the scenes, his deals were crafted with precision profit shares, ownership rights, quiet brilliance and understanding that creative power is also financial power. The films that bore his fingerprints comedies, it became cultural. Landmarks continued to generate light and livelihood for others long after their premieres. But even as the checks arrived, he gave back quietly, his generosity measured in the absence of announcements. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. It's one thing to donate money. It's another to remember why. When crisis hit, he didn't issue statements. He made calls. When an illness struck communities, he sent help without headlines. When workers across the industry lost jobs during the strikes, his contribution arrived not with a speech, but with a signature. The gesture wasn't charity, it was recognition. He remembered the boy who once counted coins for a train ride to a comedy club and knew exactly how much difference a single act of grace could make. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. In later years, his joy became quieter, more deliberate. He began treating time like treasure, not as something to spend, but to protect. There was no more running. He moved through his days like a man who had finally caught up with himself. His laughter had softened but deepened, aged like jazz, fewer notes, more meaning. When he spoke, it wasn't to fill air, but to add to it. His humor had evolved from defense to devotion. He had nothing left to prove, which made everything he said sound like truth. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Evenings in his home carried a rhythm all their own. The piano in the corner knew his fingers again. Page read quietly on the couch, and the sound of children playing layered over the faint hum of city life outside. It was a domestic symphony, no audience, no encore, just presence. This was not the life the tabloids had written for him. It was the one he had written for himself. And in that piece, he found a clarity sharper than any spotlight could provide. That greatness isn't about being seen by everyone. It's about being fully known by a few. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. The years became chapters. The chapters became lessons, and the lessons distilled into grace. He could now look back at every wound as a form of instruction. Every laugh is proof that endurance can sound joyful. The boy who once imitated the world had grown into the man who changed its rhythm. His story was no longer about fame. It was about faith in art and family and the slow miracle of continuing. From poverty to peace, from laughter to legacy, his arc was not a circle, but a spiral always rising, even when it seemed to return to where it began. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. His legend had long transcended statistics. The numbers, films, awards, earnings were just markers of motion. What endured were the echoes, the millions of unseen smiles he never got to witness, but caused nonetheless. He existed now not as an entertainer, but as an element, part of the cultural air. Everyone breathes without remembering who made it cleaner. That's immortality, the kind that doesn't need monuments because it lives in memory, reflex, rhythm. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. In the soft light of evening, you could almost imagine him stepping into his garden, hearing the faint buzz of the city beneath the hills, and smiling. The world had changed since the boy in Bushwick whispered jokes to himself to keep the dark away. But that boy was still there, smaller now, resting peacefully inside the man who had learned to carry him gently. The laughter that once saved him had done its job. The silence that frightened him had become his friend. The world, for all its noise, now owed him nothing, and he was content with that. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Age has a way of polishing perspective. In his 60s, Eddie Murphy moved through life, not as a performer trying to outrun the silence, but as a man who had finally befriended it. Each morning unfolded like a soft opening scene, coffee steaming, sunlight cutting across the marble floor, the faint laughter of children drifting down the hall. He would look around at everything the years had built, the photographs, the gold discs, the stillness, and understand something he hadn't known as a young man, that peace is not found. It's made brick by brick, breath by breath. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He had built an empire of laughter that outlived its era. The characters he'd once played, detectives, dreamers, professors, donkeys, still lived in living rooms around the world, speaking in a dozen languages, crossing oceans and generations. He had become something larger than celebrity, a symbol of endurance, a monument of humor that needed no stone. When young comedians studied him, they weren't studying jokes. They were studying truth, the way timing can reveal humanity, how laughter, when used properly, is not an escape, but a mirror. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Even now, the films still play on screens new and old. Somewhere, a kid in a small apartment sits cross-legged on a worn carpet, laughing at a scene that was filmed before they were born, unaware that the sound of their own joy is part of the legacy being kept alive. That was the magic of his craft. It aged in reverse. Every generation found its way to him, and each rediscovered the same electricity, the courage to laugh at life's heaviness without losing respect for it. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Sometimes he would visit the past the way one revisits a childhood neighborhood not to stay, but to remember. Bushwick had changed. The streets that once echoed with struggle now glowed with murals, cafes, music from open doors. Yet beneath the surface, he could still feel the rhythm of his beginnings, the pulse of a boy rehearsing voices to drown out loneliness. When he spoke of those early years, there was no bitterness, only gratitude. It taught me everything, he would say. The pain had been the tuition, the laughter, the diploma. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. The people who shaped him, parents, brother, friends, partners, remained ghosts that smiled in the corners of his memory. He carried them gently, never speaking too long about loss, but never pretending it didn't matter. When asked about his brother, his voice would lower to a whisper, and a small smile would form. "He's here," he'd say, hand over heart. That was how he honored the departed, not with drama, but with presence. Every time he made someone laugh, it was another way of saying their names. Comment 64, or write Rip Charlie Murphy to honor them. What age took from him in speed, it gave back in serenity. The man who once raced from set to set now took joy in simple movements, trimming plants, reading quietly, walking barefoot through grass, still cool from morning dew. He wasn't performing these rituals for cameras. They were his way of staying human. The body slows, but the soul learns a new tempo, and he followed it faithfully. He called it the rhythm after the applause. It was the only rhythm that never lied. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Hollywood had its cycles, new names, new headlines, new kings, but none could erase the imprint of the man who came before them. When younger performers spoke his name, it wasn't out of nostalgia, but reverence. He had made it possible for them to stand there at all. They cited his fearlessness, his refusal to compromise art for comfort, his belief that the truth of one's voice is worth any cost. He didn't just entertain, he expanded permission. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. On quiet evenings, he sometimes played old vinyl records jazz, mostly the kind with patience in its notes. He said music was the closest thing to memory you can touch. The needle would drop, and for a while, the house would dissolve. The years, the fame, the noise, all of it faded until there was only rhythm and breath. That was where he found communion with everything he'd lost and everything he'd gained. It was his private church, his own way of praying without words. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He had come to understand that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you live long enough to witness changing because of you. When he saw diversity bloom across screens that once resisted it, when he watched young black filmmakers claim stages that used to be closed, he smiled quietly. He didn't take credit. He simply recognized the pattern. He had once been the crack in the wall. Now, the wall was gone. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. When the world celebrated him with awards and retrospectives, he accepted with the calm of a man who had already found what he was looking for. He didn't give long speeches. He didn't rehearse humility. He simply thanked the crowd and then thanked the silence afterward. He said the true prize was surviving the laughter, keeping his sanity intact in a business that often devours its brightest souls. His humor had always been about survival. Now, survival itself was his final joke, gentle, earned, and divine. Comment 64, or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There were times he thought about the little boy who used to watch television light flicker on cracked paint, making shadows dance. He wished he could tell that boy, one day, the laughter you give away will build you a home. One day, the world will echo your voice. But most of all, one day, you'll be safe. The boy never heard him, but that didn't matter. The man had finally become the answer to his own prayer. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. And perhaps that's how every legend ends, not with a curtain, but with quiet recognition. The applause fades, the crowd leaves, and the artist stands alone in the soft light, realizing the show was never about fame. It was about connection, about turning private pain into collective healing. He had done that. He had given the world permission to laugh through its tears, to find beauty in absurdity, to keep going. For that, his echo would never fade. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Now, when he looks out from the balcony of his Beverly Hills home and sees the city lights trembling like stars close to Earth, he doesn't think of premieres or paychecks. He thinks of moments, the laughter that saved him, the people who shaped him, the stories that carried him. He smiles softly, hands in his pockets, breathing in the warm California air. Somewhere far away, in a small apartment in Bushwick, a child is watching one of his films for the first time, laughing the same way he once did. The circle, at last, has closed. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. In the stillness of evening, the sound of his laughter lingers like the last note of a familiar song. It isn't the roaring, uncontrollable laugh that once filled arenas, but something softer, richer, tinged with wisdom. It comes from the place inside him that survived it all. Every rise, every fall, every echo of applause that eventually fades into quiet. Eddie Murphy knows now that even silence has rhythm, and within it lives a deeper kind of music. The same boy who whispered jokes into the dark now listens to the world hum back, not with noise, but with gratitude. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There's something holy about longevity, about the ability to remain yourself while the world changes its language around you. He has seen trends come and go, stars burn bright and vanish, and yet he stands, unhurried. The magic wasn't in the timing of his punchlines or the sparkle of fame. It was in his refusal to become bitter. He learned that joy is rebellion, that laughter can be a weapon, a salve, a way to say, I'm still here. Each new generation that discovers him doesn't find an old relic. They find a voice that never stopped being honest. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. In the quiet of night, when Los Angeles dims to a faint glow, he sometimes sits at his piano. The keys remember every emotion his words couldn't carry. His fingers move slowly, finding a melody that isn't meant to be perfect, only true. Page might hum softly nearby, the children's footsteps a distant rhythm somewhere down the hall. And in that moment, surrounded by everything he once feared he'd lose, he realizes that happiness isn't the grand applause of the world, it's the simple miracle of presence. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He once said that laughter saved him, but what saved him even more was love, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that waits quietly while the lights fade. It was love that raised him from loss, that taught him how to father with intention, that rebuilt him each time the public mistook spectacle for truth. He knows now that every headline eventually yellows, every award gathers dust, but the echoes of love, real love, are eternal. They linger in the way his children laugh, in the way a friend remembers his warmth, in the way the world still turns on a better rhythm, because he existed. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. When you survive long enough to become your own history, memory stops feeling like nostalgia and starts feeling like grace. He walks through his home surrounded by photographs that tell the whole story: Bushwick, Broadway, Beverly Hills, and each one is a small monument to perseverance. There are faces that are gone now, and yet he doesn't look at them with sadness. He looks with reverence. The people who once held his hand, who pushed him, who laughed with him, they all live within him now. He doesn't need to speak their names aloud. The laughter itself is their prayer. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Sometimes, a career becomes a philosophy. Eddie Murphy didn't just redefine comedy, he redefined survival. His genius wasn't in mimicry or spectacle, but in empathy. He understood people. He knew that humor is born from the same soil as pain. He showed us that joy and sorrow are twins, inseparable, dancing together on the same stage. In every role, detective, professor, father, voice, he wasn't pretending. He was remembering. He was showing the world that no matter where you begin, the act of smiling is a declaration of defiance. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. It's easy to celebrate success, but few know how to carry it with grace. Fame once threatened to consume him. Now it bows before him. He no longer needs to prove that he belongs. His name already lives in the architecture of culture itself, in the cadence of modern comedy, in the courage of those who followed. He opened doors he never walked through himself, not because he had to, but because he could. That's legacy, not the trophies, not the wealth, but the ripple of courage that travels through generations unseen. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He often said that the hardest thing about being funny is being human at the same time. It's true. The great ones are never just clowns or storytellers. They're translators of the human condition. Eddie Murphy made humanity feel lighter without making it less. He gave permission for the world to laugh at itself without losing dignity. His gift was never just comedy, it was clarity. He helped people remember that joy is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. When he stands now before an audience, rarely, quietly, it isn't to perform but to share. His voice carries the warmth and experience, the rhythm of someone who has walked through every kind of weather and learned to dance in all of it. The laughter he inspires today isn't frantic. It's reflective. It's the kind of laughter that understands how close it lives to tears, the kind that feels like healing. Every smile in that room is proof that time didn't dim him. It refined him. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. The man who once conquered the world now prefers to tend to his garden. Fame is fleeting, but soil remembers kindness. The plants grow quietly, grateful for sunlight, much like he does. He waters them, trims them, hums softly, and in their growth sees his own. Everything he realizes has a season. Struggle, triumph, solitude, peace. The trick is not to fight them, but to live through each with an open heart. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. At night, when the stars over California burn faint and far, he sometimes steps outside and looks up. The same sky once hung over Bushwick, though he couldn't see it through the city haze. Now it stretches wide and clear. It reminds him that nothing is waste, not pain, not laughter, not time. Every moment was a thread in the tapestry of something greater. He doesn't wish to start over. He simply whispers thanks for the noise, for the silence, for it all. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. And if the world ever asks what his story meant, it's simple. It meant that joy is strength. It meant that one voice, sincere and unafraid, can change the temperature of a room, a country, a century. It meant that even those born into hardship can build empires of light. His life was a sermon disguised as a joke, a miracle delivered through laughter. And long after the credits roll, long after the last curtain falls, his echo will remain a steady hum in the soul of humanity, reminding us that laughter, when given with love, never dies. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Time has a strange mercy for those who live truthfully. It does not erase the scars, but it softens their edges until they resemble lessons more than wounds. Eddie Murphy, now standing in the late glow of life, carries those lessons like heirlooms polished by years of touch. The face that once beamed across movie posters has lines now, gentle reminders of where he's been, of what he's felt. But the eyes, those are unchanged. They still gleam with that mischievous fire, the same spark that once dared the world to laugh when it wanted to cry. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. His laughter has slowed but deepened, no longer the quicksilver burst of youth, but a seasoned melody, each note earned. He no longer laughs to hide pain or to fill silence. He laughs because he understands it. Every echo of that sound is gratitude. When the cameras do catch him these days, it isn't the star they see, it's a man at ease in his skin. That comfort, that calm, is its own form of triumph. For decades, he chased applause. Now, he knows the quiet applause that matters most is the heartbeat of contentment. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He has watched his children grow, watched them find their voices, their loves, their paths. They carry him forward not just in name, but in rhythm. Each of them a verse in the ongoing poem of his legacy. Some work in art, others in the ordinary miracles of everyday life, but all of them reflect the same truth. The man who gave laughter to millions gave stability to the ones who mattered most. Fatherhood, once something he feared he'd never master, became his proudest script. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. When he walks through his home, there are traces of the man he once was everywhere. A framed photo from his Saturday Night Live days, a poster from Beverly Hills Cop faded from sunlight, a trophy he forgot to dust, a piano holding sheet music scrawled with half-finished songs. These objects are relics, but they're also reminders that he was never just the performer. He was a dreamer who refused to stop creating, even when the world moved on. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. There are nights when he still dreams of Bushwick. The cracked walls, the warmth of neighbors who didn't have much but had each other. The sound of a city always on the edge of breaking or becoming something new. In those dreams, his father still laughs in the kitchen, his mother hums while washing dishes, and his brother leans in with that familiar grin. He wakes from those dreams not in sadness, but in gratitude. Those memories are proof that love can outlive flesh, that laughter can echo across decades and still feel near. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. His fans, millions strong, have grown older alongside him. They no longer scream his name, they smile when they hear it. He's become part of their emotional landscape, a soundtrack to their youth and their healing. Somewhere, someone is quoting a line from Coming to America or Shrek, not just for humor, but for comfort. He may never meet them, but they know him in the way that art allows us to know each other through shared feeling. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He once said that the secret to comedy is truth. The secret to life, he's since learned, is forgiveness. Forgiveness of yourself for what you didn't know. Forgiveness of others for not understanding you sooner. He carries no grudges now, only gratitude. Even the years that hurt him most, the nights that nearly broke him, have become teachers. There's a peace in his walk now, an assurance that nothing was wasted, not the pain, not the silence, not the struggle. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. He no longer seeks legacy, he lives it. It's in every echo of laughter that ripples through a living room where one of his films plays. It's in every young artist who steps onto a stage believing they, too, can turn pain into power. It's in every child of color who looks at the screen and sees not limitation, but possibility. His work reshaped the image of success. He made joy look powerful. He made humor look holy. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Hollywood has changed since the days when he ruled it, but it still remembers. There's an entire generation of performers who measure their courage against his. They quote him, emulate him, and then realize the only way to truly honor him is to find their own voice. That's the paradox of influence. You don't keep people in your shadow. You teach them how to find their own light. He did that, knowingly or not, simply by being unafraid to exist fully. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. In interviews now, he smiles more than he speaks. He deflects praise with jokes, the way some people deflect pain. But there's a serenity under it, a wisdom that only comes from having nothing left to prove. He's lived every version of success the world has to offer, and learned that the only one worth keeping is inner peace. If he gives advice, it's simple. Do it because you love it. Everything else fades. It's advice born of experience, heavy with the gravity of truth. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. As twilight gathers, there's a scene that repeats often. Him sitting on his patio, watching the city lights flicker like applause from another world. He sips tea instead of champagne. He listens to the wind instead of crowds. The laughter that once built an empire now fills only his home, and that's enough. Because in the end, that's all any artist wants. To know that what they created mattered, that they made people feel, that they turned the darkness into something that glows. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them. Eddie Murphy's story will never be summarized by dates or numbers. It will be told in the tone of voice people use when they speak his name, with warmth, with respect, with a faint smile. He is not just an entertainer. He is a testament, a reminder that the loudest laughter often comes from the deepest silence, and that even in a world obsessed with fame, there are souls who create for something purer. His light born in hardship, carried through chaos, settled in peace remains. Comment 64 or write Rip Eddie Murphy to honor them.